My baby dolls, we are back again with another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and today we have a great show. We have author John Eisenberg and his wonderful new book on The Streak, Lou Gehrig, Cal Ripken Jr., and baseball's most historic record. And we'll get to both John and the book in about 2 minutes. But of course, you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with our fearless leader, our producer, Ralph Tycho, a.k.a. the Zigzag Man. And I just want to let your listeners know that the network is growing in leaps and bounds. Nancy Finley joins Ralph on Oakland A's baseball. We got Golenbach University with Peter Golenbach and sometimes Halbach and a couple of others come in. I know Alan Blumpkin, renowned Sabre historian, is on that show. Dave Nemec, renowned author, has moved to California. We're going to try to get his show back to the network. I miss doing the show with him and Al regarding the old-time baseball and trivia. Bill Kashatis is Philadelphia baseball, present, past, and future. And I'm in the process of trying to get Eldon Ham regarding Chicago Cubs baseball and Chicago White Sox baseball. We'll see. I mean, the network's going, and we all are in for one thing, to teach you folks about stuff you may not know. And, of course, my show always deals with authors and their books and stuff that I found out a lot, especially with John's book, The Streak. And first of all, I want to just say, go out and get this book. I mean, Christmas is coming, Hanukkah's coming, the holidays are coming. It would make a great gift. It's not only the story of Lou Gehrig, not only the story of Cal Ripken Jr., it's a story about the term Iron Man and how it is in baseball history going back to 1870 and those who had streaks before Lou Gehrig and after Cal Ripken, and there's a lot of comparisons we're going to deal with on the show. There's a lot of information to cover. As for John, hey, if you don't know who John is, I mean, he's been around for 38 years, and some of the historic sports moments that John witnessed was, of course, Cal Ripken's 2,131st straight game in 1995. I watched it on TV that night. Tiger Woods' Barry and busting triumph at the 1997 Masters. Michael Jordan's career-ending buzzer beater against Utah in 1998. I think he had the flu at the time. And the Ravens' improbable Super Bowl triumph in January 2001. I don't know why it was improbable. They crushed my Giants. Before working in Baltimore, he spent 5 years with the Dallas Times Herald, where he covered high school sports and the NBA's Dallas Mavericks. And I always say I love the Mavericks. They were a powerhouse for a long, long time. Again, he was an award-winning sports columnist for the Baltimore Sun for 2 decades and is the author of The 10-Gallon War. That's about Dallas and the Houston Colt 45s, I think, or the Texans. That first season, My Guy Barbaro, co-written by jockey Edgar Prado, and The Great Match Race. He has written for the Smithsonian, Sports Illustrated, and Details, amongst other publications. And he currently contributes to the columns of BaltimoreRavens.com, and he's in Baltimore, Maryland. Welcome to the show, John.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that nice introduction. I appreciate it.
I hope I didn't butcher you too much,
No, you got it right.
That's the main thing. You grew up in Dallas down there. Your mother ran a bookstore. How'd you end up in the University of Pennsylvania?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I got into a few schools, and it just seemed I knew a couple of my friends were going to Penn that I'd met at a summer camp in Maine, actually, and so I had a little bit of an East Coast thing going. My mother had gone to Wellesley, and so it just seemed like the place to go. I was really glad I did. It was a great school paper there. Tons of my colleagues at the Daily Pennsylvanian have had long careers in journalism, sports, and otherwise, and it was a great group.
Your mother went to Wellesley. I'm about 25 miles south of Wellesley College, because I live in North Attleboro, Massachusetts, and Wellesley's a great school and stuff. So she ran a bookstore in Dallas, Texas.
She did, an independent bookstore, a really good one called the House of Books, and that was my first job. And so I grew up around books and wanted to write books. You know, I mean, I was a reader when I was a young kid, and so it sort of planted in the seed that, you know, this is something you could aspire to if you ever became a writer, which I eventually did.
Let me ask you this question. How'd you end up in Baltimore, of all places?
Well, the Baltimore Sun, I was back in Dallas, my hometown, in the early 80s. I was covering the Dallas Mavericks. I had just gotten married, and all seemed well, but the Baltimore Sun was expanding their sports section. They had brought in some new blood. They were hiring a bunch of young people, and they reached out to me and offered me a job, a great job that certainly doesn't exist in the newspaper business anymore, basically running around the world, writing feature stories and covering big events. So it seemed like a step up to me, and so I took it. And then within 3 years, they gave me a column. So I was a columnist at the Baltimore Sun by age 30, and really spent the next 2 decades doing that. So it was a fortuitous move for me.
And what did you think about? I mean, you're coming from Dallas, okay? Now Dallas has all 4 sports, I believe: basketball, hockey, football, and baseball. Baltimore is the only major city, if you go up and down the eastern seaboard, it only has 2 sports. And in fact, in 1984, the Colts moved out. They only had baseball. Why don't they have 4 sports, Baltimore?
Well, it's too close to Washington, I mean, they've got an arena. I mean, they did have the NBA. They had the Baltimore Bullets that became the Washington Bullets in the late 70s. They've only had minor league hockey. So I think they haven't had the population base. I mean, they're right in between Philadelphia and Washington, and there certainly have been some territorial restrictions to keep Baltimore from getting back into the NBA with a team. Have a nice basketball history here with high school and college, but that's the way it goes. So, no, as a matter of fact, when I got here, there was the 1984 when I got here, the Colts had left town a year earlier, and the Orioles had won the World Series for it proved the last time, it seems. So it was definitely entering a dry period when I got here.
Yeah, and then, of course, the Browns moved to Baltimore. Modell took the team, and, people don't even know. I mean, it's been, 21 years since the Ravens were introduced, and they won 2 Super Bowls, I think, during that time.
Yeah.
How does the city, how fan crazy is it for Baltimore Orioles and Baltimore Ravens?
Well, my observation, it's a really good sports town. The Ravens, they sell out every game and have for a long time. They have a great home environment. And they've had a nice record here. 2 Super Bowls in 20 years, that's pretty good. They've been in the playoffs, championship games, all sorts of stuff. So they've developed a really nice following here. The Orioles, I mean, they've been here over a half century. They have an incredible fan base. They don't draw always. It's like every team, you got to win. But they have, for my money, the most beautiful ballpark in America, Camden Yards, built in 1992, and many of the stadiums built since then have tried to copy it. And wonderful ambiance, and as I said, I think the best place in America to watch a ball game. That brings fans in. Listen, whenever the Yankees come here, there's thousands of fans here coming down to have a nice weekend and play. Same with the Red Sox. So, they draw well. It's for the 2 teams that are here. It's a good place to be a franchise.
I went to the old Memorial Stadium on 33rd Street back in 1991, and back then I remember the neighborhood wasn't too good. I have only been back to Baltimore since '97. Pretty much around that time, they refurbished Indiana Harbor, which is totally an awesome experience for anyone who wants to visit Baltimore. It's just a great place in the city. But you wrote a book from 33rd to Camden Yards. What was the basis for getting interested in such a vast topic as the streak?
Well, what I was looking for was, this is my 9th book, and I had written my prior 2 books on professional football, and have really, since I left the Baltimore Sun in 2007, 10 years ago, I've been writing football almost exclusively. And so to be very honest, I missed baseball. The years covering the Orioles, writing columns on Deadline, when they were selling out Camden Yards, some of my favorite memories in journalism. And I missed baseball, so I was looking for a subject. And, of course, the writer's credo is write what you know. And what did I know? I was there for every touchstone moment in Cal Ripken's career. And it had been 20 years. And it just struck me as an interesting subject. I mean, it's so well-versed here in Baltimore that I would have to go about it, though, in an original fashion. So what was I going to do? So I just came across this idea, just thought of this idea. Of course, the Lou Gehrig, the Gehrig story, the legend, just hovered over Ripken that entire time. And such a powerful figure. And I thought, well, why don't I compare those streaks? Because they're the only two ball players that have had these long, long streaks over 2,000 games. It's the same record. It's the same achievement, but so different in every way. I mean, because of the eras they played. I mean, day games against night games, train travel against plane travel. You could just go on and on, literally dozens of categories. So I thought that would be interesting. So I sold this concept to my editor at Houghton Mifflin in Boston, and so I embarked on this project. But as soon as I got into it, I realized I can't tell the story of these two streaks and these two competitors without really telling the whole story of this record, this whole concept of playing every day for years on end. It's such an unusual record, honestly, such a weird record, because there's no other. I mean, if you hit a bunch of home runs, people just say, great job. If you strike out a bunch of batters, people say, great job. If you play in 2,000 games in a row, people still applaud you, but they ask you, well, why did you do that? I mean, who cares? Is it that important? Does it help your team? There are many, many questions that arise, and so I embarked on this long project of telling the story of this record, and that's what really created the framework for telling the stories of these two streaks. It became a much larger project. It took me 4.5 years in the end because there was a lot of storytelling to get through.
But look at all the people that you interviewed. Frank Robinson, Steve Garvey. Reading your book, I didn't even know that he still holds the record for the National League with someone 1,400 games played. I mean, it must have been something to go out and seek these guys and give it, an eyewitness, a primary account of what a streak entails. Yeah,
well, it was really fun. It's what I do. It's what I've done for a living for many years. I've written a lot of sports history, and I love nothing more than digging into the background, and you get these stories on your fingertips. You go back and read the old papers, and you find out what happened, and you go and interview these guys, the ones that are still around. And, I've been doing it a long time, and I love it. I mean, I sat down with Billy Williams. I sat down with Steve Garvey. I sat down with Dale Murphy. Sat down with Cal. And as you said, I know all these Orioles guys, Frank Robinson, Brooks Robinson. So, it's a privilege, honestly, that I don't take lightly. It's fun to be able to do that. And so, I definitely had a story in mind, and they helped me tell it. And, that aspect of it, never stops being just flat out fun.
Now, let me ask you this. When you were writing the book, again, you covered Cal Ripken for most of his career, if not all of it. When you were doing your book, you're doing the research, and the finished product came, were you concerned about what Cal would think of the book when it came out?
Well, I was concerned isn't the right word. I mean, I didn't know what he would think. I mean, whatever. I just set out to tell the story as I found it. And he cooperated with the book, my telling of the story. I mean, we sat down for long interviews. He was calling me back. I mean, towards the end of it, Cal's a pretty analytical guy, and so when I told him what I was doing, that I was going to analyze his streak with Gehrig, he liked that idea, and so he thought it was fun to go back and compare his record to Gehrig's and go through it all, train travel, the size of the glove, all this stuff, that it was going to be the history of the record. I think he liked that. So I had no problem getting him to sit down and talk about this stuff. He called me back one day towards the end of it. He was on a bike ride. He said, "Hey, he's like giving me editorial advice, you know. He's like saying, did you see what happened with Joe Madden and in 2010 with Evan Longoria, which was I'm getting ahead of the story here, but it was basically a moment when Longoria had a streak going, Tampa Bay, when Madden was in Tampa Bay, and Madden ended the streak and said, we don't want a Cal Ripken streak here. He said, look that up. And so I looked it up, and sure enough, it happened, and I put it in the book. It was sort of almost like the funeral dirge of consecutive game streaks, which have been eliminated from baseball almost entirely. And that was sort of a seminal moment. So Cal is helping me there. And so I had no problem. So, you know, as for what the final product is and what he thinks of it, I don't know. I haven't heard from him, and I assume he found it somewhat interesting, and I don't know if he learned anything, but I think he knows what was going to be in this book, so I'm pretty sure he's fine with it.
Now, I know when you interviewed Cal, you know, and he convinced you of this, is he wasn't playing to break streak. He was playing, it was a sense of duty, and if he was able to play, he's going to play. Let's go into that.
Well, yes, that's really where there's tension in this book, because Cal for many years has fought the perception that he set out to break Gehrig's record, and that was his motivation to keep going, even when he was hitting 210 some years, and you know probably should have taken a seat. You know, why was he doing that? That's a question that has certainly been on the minds of a lot of fans for many years. It was a big subject in Baltimore, and you know, as a columnist of the Sun, listen, there were times when I wrote, you know, maybe he needs to take a rest, you know, when he was not hitting well. So I went into this project with some skepticism about his steadfast statements about how he would never chase Gehrig. It was just a byproduct of his desire, his philosophy of being in the lineup every day if the manager wanted him in there. It was a philosophy that came from his father, Cal Ripken Sr., who was an old-school baseball guy, really instilled in his boys, because his other son, Billy, also played Major League Baseball, really instilled in them sort of the fundamentals of how to go about being a professional. And, you know, you get to the ballpark early, you take BP, you take infield, you get your head in the game, and if your manager wants you out there, you get your rear end out there, especially if you're being paid a lot of money. So, that's where it came from, and you know, it's his DNA. It was in Cal's DNA. So I sort of realized one revelation that I had as I researched this book was I may have gone into the project with some skepticism about his motivations, but I came out of it really understanding where he came from as a ball player with this philosophy of wanting to be out there. You know, I am sure at some point as he got close to the record, he was going to set that record, and it was important to him and all that. There's no doubt. But this whole thing of playing every day and being there every day, that came from the philosophy that his father instilled in him as a young boy, and he carried it way beyond what Cal Sr. ever imagined. But that is where it came from, more of a philosophy than wanting to set that record.
And remember, Cal was born in 1960. So again, look at the eras, the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Pitches went 7, 8 innings, 9 innings. You know, you'll never see, I don't think, another record that will be a 300-game winner, because now things are timed. You know, pitching. There's no more Iron Man pitches. There's no more Warren Spahn versus Juan Marichals. All this stuff now is to prevent injury, but yet, look, Lou Gehrig got hit in the head with a pitch in a exhibition game against Norfolk, and McCarthy's like, I'm not going to end this streak. He's going to play the next day if he can.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly what I learned in my research was the whole philosophy of being a quote-unquote everyday player. You go back to Gehrig there, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, there was not nearly as much tinkering with the lineup as we see today. I mean, the managers, they didn't have all these analytics, these numbers, these things that drive their decisions now. You know, you put your best ball players out there, period. And so Gehrig was obviously one of the Yankees' one of the greatest players of all time. they weren't going to take him out of the lineup if at all possible, and he wanted to be out there. And so his sort of desire just out, that was more important than anything. And he was able to play with these various injuries that he had. And, he would grip the bat differently. He would figure out a way to do it. And he could make something happen with the bat and with his glove. And so the philosophy of being there every day for your team, that's prevailed when Gehrig played, and it still prevailed when Ripken played. But it no longer prevails with, the injuries, as you cited, the concern for injuries and these analytical statistics that change decision-making and give managers reason to sit guys on certain nights. Streaks are gone, but the philosophy prevailed in the eras of these two guys.
Now, I going through your book, I mean, Ripken and Gehrig played through both broken thumbs, I know Ripken, I think he fell off his bike, which, again, he really hurt his back, and that was one of the reasons why he stopped this streak, because he couldn't actually do it anymore.
Well, no, actually, he fell off his bike. That was actually after. He fell off his bike, after. That was the day he was going to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the streak, and he was going to go down to Camden Yards. They're going to have a pregame ceremony, and he falls off his bike, wound up tearing his rotator cuff and had surgery. So, he couldn't have played through that back in the day. But he was lucky never to have Gehrig played with more broken bones than Ripken. I think some of the stuff Gehrig played through, I'm not sure Ripken would have played through. The fractured shoulder blade, all these broken thumbs and fingers. Cal had a sprained knee at one point, had a sprained ankle at one point. He was able to get through that. No broken bones, not that I know of. Gehrig really played through pain, through broken bones more than Ripken.
Now, let me ask you this, because when you think of a streak, you just think of the title itself. But look at all the parables that go into, which you mentioned: schedule, media pressure, field surfaces. These are things no one thinks of. Positional demand, streak integrity, travel. Especially with schedule. I mean, back then there was no night games with Lou Gehrig. He had to play in the burning hot sun. Cal didn't have to do that.
No. There's pros and cons to both sides for sure. No, Cal had to. Gehrig played every day in the hot sun. No night games, no relief. But yet Gehrig also never had to play a game at 12:30 that started at 12:30 after one ended at 2 a.m. the night before because of television. Cal had to do that dozens of times. There are all sorts of ways to gauge this and to say, a pro against, who had it easier. Cal told me that if he could put himself in the way, if he was a budding Ironman and could put himself in the Wayback Machine to one of those two eras with the intention of being an Ironman, which would be better? Cal said he would go to Gehrig's era. He said that's the better era because every day at 3 o'clock you played baseball. Yes, it was in the sun, but the rhythm, you could tune your body. You were in a routine. It never varied. He said that was the hardest part for him was the weird start times due to television, night games, day games, TV games, West Coast travel. Gehrig never had that. You could keep your body in sync better, and that was what Cal said was the decider for him.
Let me ask you this question, like with Maris, Mark McGwire, hits the home run. Maris breaks Babe Ruth's record and gets an asterisk. Why don't we have an asterisk here, played in such and such era under such and such conditions?
Well, there's no. There's no. What would the asterisk be under? It wasn't a record it wasn't a single season record. Yes, baseball conditions have changed, but it was. It's the same game. It's the same game, and routinely now records that were set in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, when they're broken, there's no asterisks there. I'm not sure the asterisk was appropriate for Maris, but that was the difference. He did take 8 more games to break Babe Ruth's record, so I understand where that came from. But that was not the case with the Ironman streak. It was just consecutive games played, period. I mean, went through many different things.
Now you go back to 1870. Let's talk about George Pinckney for a second here. What was going on with him?
Well, George Pinckney is the first Ironman of baseball. He played in the 1880s and 90s. He played third base, 578 straight games. Played for Brooklyn before they were the Dodgers. They were called the Bridegrooms because a couple of the players got married one off season, so they changed the name to the Bridegrooms. And he was the third baseman. He was a good third baseman, good defense, kind of a little fat guy, to be honest with you, but agile and had good eyes, and he played without a glove a lot of the time. And he played in 578 straight games, and no one even knew that. The statistical apparatus in baseball was not nearly sophisticated enough to track stuff like that. They only knew he was dependable, and it took years, really. It took years for the first wave of statisticians, the Elias Bureau guys, and when the first guys came in the early 1900s, only then did they go back and track what had happened before them. Did they discover the exact number of games that Pinckney had played in 578?
But let's just think about this for a second. The dead ball era had gloves that looked paper thin. These guys were using pretty much their bare hands to get balls.
Yeah.
So when a ball was hit, your hand could fall off. There's been plenty of, accounts of ball players being carried off the field, for God's sakes, from injuries like that. Wouldn't you think that's a harder place to play in that era compared to what Gehrig and Cal had to deal with?
Well, I think they probably had plenty of bruises on their hands, that's for sure, and scrapes and cuts and yeah, I would say that is pretty tough. Taking a line drive off the hands, I didn't ask Cal that question. I should have asked him that. How many games in a row could you have played with bare hands? It wouldn't have been 2,632. I can guarantee you that.
But you see something, that's why I'm saying an asterisk. You can't compare these guys. These guys got paid like nickels and dimes, even well into the dead ball period, because of baseball's monopoly. Like you mentioned, TV wasn't big. Marvin Miller hasn't come onto the scene until the late 1960s. But even the conditions of these guys back in the 18th, there was rowdyism. There was betting going on. People used to storm the field and chase the umpire if they made a wrong call. And it was very dangerous because the ball, they used one ball throughout the game. It would get all scuffed up and spit. They couldn't even see the ball when it came to night. They had to call the games. And, of course, Carl Mays, the whole incident there where Ray Chapman made a need to change the ball. The dynamics are wholly different.
Well, that's what the beauty of this story, I think, is I uncovered it, because really the overarching story of this book is how baseball just continually evolves and how it changes. And it's certainly evident in the history of consecutive game streaks, not just in sort of that record itself, and as it becomes a goal and sort of an achievement that is in the light that people want to attain, which took a long time, but just the game, period, as all those things you mentioned. Baseball has always changed, and it continues to change. It is always evolving. So, that's why I just don't think you can put asterisks there. This sport has changed a lot in the 22 years since Ripken set this record. It has changed a lot, and you know what? In the next 22 years, it will probably change as much as it has in the previous 22. So this game is always evolving, and that's what makes it so interesting.
Now, let's talk about Walter Scott, Steve Brody. What was going on with him?
Everett Scott is was the record holder, the Ironman record holder that Gehrig passed. And he was, you could take it 100, he was a little shortstop for the Red Sox and the Yankees, played during and after World War I. If you take 100 players from that era, line them up and say, all right, pick out the Ironman, he would be the last one you would pick up. He weighed about 130 pounds. He's a little shortstop with bug eyes and big ears, and he's a pipsqueak. But he got it in his head that he wanted to be out there every day, and he couldn't hit. He was a real good defensive player, and that was his value. So when he slumped at the plate, it didn't matter. They wanted him there for his defense. So when he hit 200, he could stay in the lineup, which was key. And he became the key to the defense on those teams, and he just played every day. It became his goal to play in 1,000 straight games. And when he did play in 1,000 straight games, it was a huge deal. 1923, it was on the cover of the Sporting News, the Christian Science Monitor, the Wall Street Journal wrote about it. It was just something that no one had seen before in baseball, a guy who was so determined to play every day. And so when his streak ended in 1925, he was benched. Gehrig was on the Yankees bench and watched it as a young man and watched this happen. And so I think it planted in Gehrig's seed, it planted the seed in his head, not necessarily that he wanted to do this, but that it was something you could attain. You could aspire to this. You could have a consecutive game streak. So that is definitely, Everett Scott is where the idea first came to Gehrig.
Now here's something very interesting. You got a pitcher in here, and you got Joe Iron Man McGinnity. What's going on with him?
Well, that's the evolution of the nickname, Iron Man. I mean, an Iron Man in baseball was not always a guy that played every day. If you go back to the early 1900s, the Iron Men were the pitchers. Of course, it was a completely different way of dealing with pitchers back then, not nearly the care taken with arms that we would see later. They just ran those guys out there till their arms fell off, and Joe McGinnity played he pitched 400-something innings one year. Just insane. I mean, the agent would probably sue the team if that happened now. It's a career ender. But, that's what they did back then. And so he got the nickname Iron Man. So that was like 1902 or 1903. So that was an Iron Man in baseball. It wasn't until the 1920s that you began to see newspaper reporters, sports writers, refer to these consecutive game guys as Iron Men. It became something else down the line.
And what was interesting about McGinnity is he used to pitch like in both doubleheaders.
Yeah, he played both ends of doubleheaders. He's a great character. He's quite a character. He punched an umpire once, and he's just a classic ball player from the early era. With I think he was a bartender. He touches all those hallmarks of what baseball was like around the turn of the century.
Now here's an asterisk and an FYI for McGinnity. He worked in an iron foundry during baseball off seasons, and he was nicknamed Iron Man due to it, but the name stuck. And to convey what he was doing and his durability, that, like you said, got picked up and applied to everyone else.
Yes, that was the origins of the nickname. It's sort of some sports writer somewhere came up with it. They worked in an iron foundry in the off season. So somebody said, "Oh, he's an Iron Man," and look, he's also an Iron Man because he pitches. So they called him Iron Man. Iron Man McGinnity, a great name out of the past.
I do a lot of research on the dead ball era. And in fact, I'm writing a book now, whole Tris Speaker and Ty Cobb ordeal in 1926 and 7. And Smokey Joe Wood was just like one of those guys that they just overused. His arm just like fell off and he got injured. And I've listened to the tapes, and that's the real Iron Man persona when you go back to the dead ball, and these guys are just on the mounds every 2-3 days. I mean, Walter Johnson, Cy Young, these guys are pitching every 2 days. Maybe they're pitching doubleheaders. Maybe they're coming in for relief. There was no pitching count. Yeah, and there's so many records we don't know that happened because of this. What did your research tell you?
Well, I didn't really get into the pitching aspect of it very much with my research because I was focusing on these consecutive games. But yeah, I mean, I do know the history of that era, and there certainly were. I mean, it's just as you said. I mean, it was just a different approach to pitching. If you really look at the history, you go back and look at like the innings pitched leaders. It peaks in the early 1900s, 400-something innings and all that stuff. That ceases to be. That was quickly determined to be too much. And it became 300 and something and then less. So they figured it out as they went along. But, there was still, for many, many years, pitching rotation was 4 at the most per team. And so these guys pitched all the time.
Now, Everett Deacon Scott, he was the benchmark that really set the foundation for Gehrig. Let's talk about him.
Yeah, well, Deacon Scott, he was the guy that played in those games and really brought it into the light. As I mentioned, he played in 1,307 games, and Gehrig was sitting on the bench when his streak ended when Miller Huggins benched him. And that was, of course, the day when, a month later, Gehrig's streak begins. Everett Scott is benched. I don't have the dates in front of me, but it's fairly early in the season. And in early June 1925, Gehrig's streak begins, and that's the day that he shows up at the ballpark. Actually, his streak began with a pinch hitting appearance. He bats in the 8th inning of a game against the Senators, and the next day is the day that Wally Pipp famously comes to the ballpark, says he has a headache. He's the Yankees' first baseman. And so Miller Huggins says, we'll take the day off. We'll put the kid in there, and we'll get you back in there. And the kid was Gehrig, who wound up playing, 2,130 straight games. The Wally Pipp story is a famous story. It was actually the second day of his streak. He started with a pinch hitting performance the day before.
Let me ask you this. I'm going to go into two different things here, but pretty much on the same level. We got Eddie Yost and we got Stan Musial. Now, Eddie Yost took shortcuts to get to a streak of 829 games. How did that happen?
Well, what happened was after Gehrig's streak ended, Gehrig played in all these games, and then his streak ended, and of course he, his tragic demise and dies in 1941. After that, the consecutive game record was one of the most famous records in all of baseball. So if you go back and look at it, in the 40s, after the war, and the 50s, the guys are doing this stuff. It was something, Gehrig's achievement was still relatively fresh, and you see a lot of guys doing consecutive game records, streaks of 800, 900 games, playing every day. That's just the way the game was. And yeah, Eddie Yost with the Senators, he played in 800 and something games, but the key was there was no language in the rule book that governed what an appearance was, what an official game played was. So you could really, really resort to shenanigans to keep your streak going. Eddie Yost would start a game on the bench. The manager would bring him in for one batter or two batters in the field and then take him out. And that counted as a game played. Now, Musial, he is a great player, of course, did the all-time shenanigan for consecutive games. He extended his record one night in Pittsburgh without ever setting foot on the field. It was his manager's idea. He had hurt his hand. Stan was batting fifth. He put him in the lineup, and the manager went to the umps before the game. This was in 1957, I believe, and says to the umpire, listen, if I put Stan in the lineup and pinch hit for him in the first inning, will that count as a game play because he was in the lineup? The umpire said yes. So the Cardinals did this. Musial was pinch hit for in the top of the first, never played in the game, but the National League let his streak continue because his name was in the box score, because he was in the lineup. And he went on to set the National League record and hold it for a number of years. Now, he did admit that when he did set the record, he's kind of laughing. He said, I kind of cheated, but, which he did do. But, only in 1973 was there language put into the rule book about what an appearance could be, as far as, you had to play a half inning of defense or bat, one or the other, and that was a game appearance, and that only became official in 1973.
Wow. Now let's look at one of my favorite players, Stan the Man. He didn't even play in a game, and yet he got credit for it.
Right. That's the one I mentioned, and there were a number of shenanigans, and so that sort of ended with the insertion of the language into the rule book. 1973, the designated hitter had come in. Charlie Finley was talking about the designated runner coming in, which never happened. And so the scoring rules committee said, we need to pin this down. What counts as a game appearance? And so that's when they came up with the half inning of defense, 1 at bat, and pinch running did not count. So only after that did it. You saw far fewer shenanigans after that.
And Musial was in another crazy play. 2 balls were in play in 1959 when the Cardinals were playing the Cubs, and it was just a crazy thing. Ernie Banks was covering second. The ball got away, but Banks had another ball because the original ball hit the bat boy. It was something crazy went on in that game. I don't know if you've come across it in research. Yeah, you got to look it up. It's a fascinating thing. Now, here's a good comparison, which you have in the book. We got Billy Williams is wondering why the heck is he doing this to even try to break the record. We got Steve Garvey who wants to break the record. What's going on with these two?
Well, Billy Williams broke Musial's record and held it. He was a great outfielder with the Cubs. He's in the Hall of Fame. And, when I interviewed him, even as he was doing it, you could go back and read the newspaper clippings, and he would say, God, I don't know why I'm doing this. I mean, you get kind of tired. But he kept doing it. It was in his blood, he said. And then all these years later, that's what he explained to me when I interviewed him. He said, you get it into your head that you have to be out there, even if you're not hitting. You're gonna break out of your slump. You just feel like you have to be out there, and so he did. So he set the record. Finally took a day off because he needed a break, he thought. And then along comes Garvey with the Dodgers about a decade later. And he absolutely wanted to break. Unlike Cal Ripken, who said he didn't want to break Gehrig's record, Garvey did. It just was outspoken about it, saying, I'm aiming for that record. I think Lou Gehrig's record is one of the great things in sports. I think I can break it. He got to 1,206 games when he broke his thumb sliding into home on a ball that got away from the catcher who was trying to score from third. And that was the end of his streak. And he was 32 at the time, and he just signed with the Padres, and he would have gone on for a while, I think. They were going to let him play. Wasn't quite at his peak anymore. He's still solid. He might have gotten close to that record, but he broke his hand. And let me tell you, interviewing him 30 years later about it, he's practically in tears still over the fact that he was unable to break that record. And the day, telling the story of when he broke his thumb, the day that he was denied the chance to take on Gehrig's record.
And another thing about Steve Garvey, which you mentioned in the book, he was going through a brutal divorce in 1981, and he suffered with migraines and sleeping at night. I mean, people don't understand that it's not only a physical thing, it's a mental thing to get up and go to the ballpark and do this.
Well, this is what Dale Murphy told me. I interviewed Dale Murphy, who was an excellent outfielder for the Braves in the mid-'80s, and he's got one of the top 10 or 15 streaks in history. And he took himself out of the lineup, and looking back all these years later, said he would never do it again to have a streak. That physically, you can do it. It's not that hard in baseball. The tough thing is mental. As you said, getting there every day and being up for the game every day for years on end takes a toll. He said there's inevitably times when you need to take a rest. And he came to that realization, and he played all the time, but, he did take rest for the rest of his career, and he told me, he said, his quote, he said, a streak is a thing with pros and cons. There are good things and bad. The good things is that you're there for your team every day, and that's great. The bad things are you probably should be taking a day off now and then.
When Cal took himself out in 98, I think they were playing the Yankees, if I recall in your book.
Right.
And everyone's like, what's going on? But the Yankees was very gracious that they all stood up and gave him a round of applause. I thought that was beautiful.
Yes, that was a great moment. The Yankees realized it even before the fans did. I mean, the game just started that night at Camden Yards, and within a minute, the fans realized it, but the Yankees immediately were on the cows in the dugout. And the Yankees were on the top step there applauding almost instantly. It was great to see.
Now, you mentioned, as of today's game, you can't really say never, like you said in a conversation, that nothing, never do it. But you did mention that baseball will continue to evolve. Like last month when Aaron Judge was hitting the skids on the Yankees, they shut him down a few days. Like, oh, so much for Cal Streak. Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying because I was reading your book at the time. That's the first thing that popped into my mind. If it evolves differently, is it possible or probably we might see another Iron Man streak?
Well, I suppose when you frame it that way, it is possible. You never know what's going to come down the line in terms of sort of the popular notions. Sports do change. It's hard to imagine, though, at this point that that's going to evolve that way. They've just come up with so many things. Like when I was promoting this book, I've been promoting this book, I did an interview with a radio station in Denver, and they were telling me about Nolan Arenado, the Rockies' excellent third baseman. And he likes to play every day. But the franchise, the manager and the front office came to him and said, look at these numbers. They had his statistics the day after a day off. And they're great. He hits a home run all the time. He bats 500. And so they were like, Nolan, you need to rest every once in a while. And he was like, oh, well, okay, look at these numbers. They had scientific evidence, statistical proof. I just think there's so much now, you can quantify in so many ways. I just find it hard to believe that in the long run they're going to think it's a good idea to play every day without taking a rest. I think it's gone.
Yeah, I think it's gone too, to tell you the truth, especially with all these numbers that they play. Let me ask you this: did I forget anything that you might like to tell the people that listening on our show?
No, I don't think so. I enjoyed this very much. It's I look at this book as sort of it was a research journey that I took. As I said, I started out talking about two guys. I wound up talking about a lot more guys and a crazy record. There's all sorts of baseball stuff in there. It's the story that it's not only the history of the game, but the history of statistics and the history of baseball philosophy, and it touches on all sorts of things. And it took me 4.5 years. Most of my books take a lot less time, but this one was a complicated subject, and I've been gratified by the response. Some great reviews in places like the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and wonderful response. And I encourage people to give it a look. I think they will enjoy it.
Now, let me ask you this. You got speaking engagements coming up on the 22nd and a few others in Maryland. Do you go outside the state to do the speaking engagements regarding the book?
Well, I haven't done any. I've done a ton of media all over the country, TV, radio, podcasts like this one. I haven't done book signings per se. If someone wants me, though, I would be interested for sure.
Where can we reach you? That's exactly where I'm hitting on this point.
Well, I have a website, and I'm easily reached. I'm on the internet. I have johneisenberg.com. Can always be reached through that. And I hear from people all the time. I hear from readers, positively, negatively, all sorts of stuff. So that's always an easy, great way to get me.
And of course, we can get this at Amazon. Where else can we get it?
Yes, Amazon anywhere. It's a major publisher, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and wide distribution. Amazon, Barnes & Noble stores, any independent store, or depending on where you are, if you're listening, if they don't have it, they can order it. It's very easily bought anywhere, really.
Fantastic. Hold the line. I want to thank you for being on the show today. I think, as you folks have heard, I think this is one heck of a book to read. You're going to learn a lot. You're going to learn about things you never even thought of. Go out, get the book, get it for a gift. Holiday season's coming up. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.